homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today we are canning peaches, and I've been working on this series of videos that are kind of beginning canner videos. So when you very first start canning and you're just learning the process, there are 2 or 3 things that most people can as their first canning projects. One of those is some kind of jam or canned fruit. One of them is canned tomatoes, and one of them is salsa. And so tomatoes, salsa, canned fruit, or jam, those are often beginning canner experiences. And so today I wanted to show you how to can peaches. And this process is pretty much the same if you were canning other fruits. So if you were canning plums, if you were canning nectarines, if you were canning apricots, if you were canning cherries. So the basic process is the same. The reason that canning fruit is safe is because almost all fruits, not all, and so be sure to look it up and use a tested recipe, but most fruits are low enough in pH that they are pretty much bomb-proof in terms of home canning. Peaches are one of those, although white peaches tend to be a little bit less acidic. And so if you find recipes for canning white peaches, usually you're adding acid to the mix rather than just leaving them plain. This is home canned peaches from my trees. The peaches come in 2 basic varieties, which is cling or freestone. And the cling peaches tend to be the ones that are ripe earliest in the season. And so when you start seeing peaches in late June, early July, those are almost always cling. And then as you get into late July and August, and sometimes even into September, you start getting into the freestones. Canning peaches are usually freestone peaches just because it's so much easier to can a piece of fruit where you can easily remove that pit. And so that's what I'm going to show you. This particular variety of peach is called Red Haven, and I've had this peach tree in the ground for about 8 years now, and I get a very nice crop off of it each year. The other big tip I have for you is if you're trying to dip peaches in hot water and take them out to peel them, and they are just not peeling. That peel is sticking, and you're removing a ton of flesh, and it's a giant nightmare, which has happened to me more than once. Those peaches aren't ripe enough yet. Let them sit out on the counter for another couple of days. Almost always when I have problems with peaches that won't peel easily, no matter how long I heat them for, it's because they're not quite ripe. And so it's a good way to test, especially if you have your own peach trees. You can dip a couple of them and see if they peel easily. And if they don't, you know they're not ready, and let them sit for a little while. It can be absolutely maddening to get into a batch of peaches. You've got the time allotted, you're ready to can peaches, and you dip them and try to peel them, and the peels won't come off. It sucks. So that's typically what's happening, not ripe enough. And then the other thing is, most of the time when you see recipes for canning peaches, you're canning a half. And so you're just cutting that peach in half, taking that pit out, and then putting that half peach into the jar. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's a density thing or if it's just a presentation thing where everybody loves the look of a half of a peach in a jar. One thing is you're going to want to invest in some wide mouth jars. It's very, very hard to can peaches in a regular mouth jar just because the neck of that jar is narrow and it's difficult to get the peaches in there. And I personally will quarter my peaches. I don't think they need to be in a half sized, and I think you can get more peaches in a jar when they're quartered, and so I just quarter them. And then also because I have my own fruit trees and they're a little bit scratch and dent, so sometimes I'm cutting off, a section that's got a bruise or a bird peck. My peaches aren't always gorgeous as a half a peach, and so being able to quarter them, I think it just makes more sense for me to do it that way. In terms of sugar and adding a sugar syrup to your peaches, I'll put the details up on the screen in the video itself, but you can can peaches in just plain water. They are acidic enough that you don't even have to add sugar if you don't want to, or you can use a sugar substitute that's heat stable. However, that sugar is giving you some protection against oxidation. It's helping keep those peaches from turning brown. And so if you're canning in plain water, you're gonna wanna eat them fairly quickly. They're not gonna look appetizing in a year. I tend to can in a light syrup. So there's different categories. I'm not interested in them being super, super sweet, but I will do a light syrup just because that syrup adds a little bit of protection. And then I will often just drain that syrup off and use it in smoothies or things like that. So things where I just need a little bit, or actually it's really lovely in iced tea as well. But I use a light syrup, and that just has to do with the percentage of sugar to water in terms of the syrup that you make. But that's a huge hint. Most people don't understand. I know I didn't understand when I started canning fruit, and it gave me all these different options for syrup, and it didn't explain why I should choose one over the other. And the reality is it's completely up to you based on how sweet the fruit is and how sweet you like your finished product, but it is not in there for preservation purposes, at least in terms of safety. It is in there to some extent for oxidation. You can dip your peaches in something like Fruit Fresh or ascorbic acid, and that will help set the color so that they don't oxidize and turn brown. In my case, in this recipe, and maybe this is a totally wrong thing to do, but I ended up just adding some Fruit Fresh directly to the syrup itself. Not a lot. I think I used a teaspoon in the entire batch, but it's a lot less fussy to do that than it is to individually make up a batch of the Fruit Fresh dip and then have to hand dip every one of those peach pieces before you put them in jars. So I just added a little bit to the syrup itself. Who knows? But I don't think there's going to be a safety issue because basically it's adding to the acidity of the syrup itself. So canning peaches, definitely a lovely project to do in late August, early September. Let's get started.
So I'm going to blanch these peaches in order to get the skins off. And you can see some of these are bruised. And so there's a little bit of damage on there. And I'm using a really big pot. This pot was at a full boil before I started putting peaches in it, but I'm going to drop the temperature in there rather dramatically because I'm basically going to fill it up. And then I'm going to blanch these for 1 or 2 minutes. And they're ripe enough that the skin is going to come off even though that temperature has dropped quite a bit. So I'm not overly worried about it. I'm picking them out one at a time simply because I'm going to do a second batch. And so I wanted that water to come back to a boil, so I didn't just dump it out in the sink. And then this is a nice sink full of cool water to bring the temperature back down as quickly as possible. I don't worry about putting ice in there. And then here's an example of peeling. And you can see by looking at this that this is not a perfect peach. It's got some bruising on it. It's got a little bit of damage at the top. And so I'm just going to cut out the worst bits here and can the rest. And I actually did, as I was putting them in the syrup later, you'll see me, I'm sorting them into ones that I'm going to just freeze for smoothies and things like that, and ones that I'm going to put in the can. The ones that had the most damage, I'm just freezing rather than canning. And when you hear statistics about how much food waste we have in the United States, about 20% of that food waste is simply fruit or vegetables that never get off the farm because they're damaged in the process of growing them. So here I'm making my light syrup. I need 5 1/4 cups of water and 2 1/4 cups of sugar. And again, I'm reusing my big canner here to make this syrup. I have several of these really big pots, which is really nice. Getting the heat going on that, giving it a good stir. Don't just dump the sugar in there and turn the heat on without stirring it. You will caramelize and burn the sugar because it will all just sink to the bottom. Ask me how I know. A little bit of vinegar in my canning pot and getting the water starting to heat up for that. And here I'm sorting and I'm very gently stirring these in. This is called a hot pack when you heat the fruit with the syrup. You can also do a raw pack where you don't heat the fruit, but fruit has quite a bit of air in it, and when you heat it in the syrup, it releases a lot of that air. You can get more in a jar, and they also don't float nearly as much, and so I like doing a hot pack rather than a raw pack. And then I'm just filling my quart jars here. I didn't weigh or measure out anything. I knew I had enough peaches here to probably do close to 6 or 7 quarts. And so I made enough sugar syrup for one batch, knowing that I would probably have a little bit of syrup left over. And I'm filling these basically kind of 1 inch of headspace with the actual fruit, and then a half an inch by the time I fill it up with the syrup. And I had a friend over for dinner while I was doing this, and so I'm not very organized in terms of getting all of my jars organized. I also didn't quite know how much I was going to have, and so I just kept adding jars. But yeah, half an inch headspace on here. And then this is where I'm topping off with some of the syrup. And you always see instructions telling you to debubble your jars. I don't honestly worry about that much because the liquid inside that jar is often boiling by the time I take it out of the canner, and that boiling is creating air pockets. And so I don't want a giant air pocket in there. I do try to make sure the fruit is fairly well down in the jar, and I'll give it a little bit of a twirl or a twist to release any extra air. But I don't spend a lot of time with a stick in there stomping around trying to release any minor air pockets, because I think they're just going to release themselves as the contents come to a boil. Wipe your rims and then cap your jars, and then finger tight on the actual bands. You don't want them so tight that air can't escape. That's part of what you're doing here. And then I've got 5 quarts and 1 pint is what I ended up with. And the extra syrup, I actually strained it, and I've been using it in iced tea, so it's been quite lovely. Quarts are processed for 25 minutes and pints for 20. And then I turn the canner off and let them sit for 5 more minutes before I remove them from the pot. But that's all there is to it. This is a really quick project, and it's absolutely lovely to have these on your shelves for the rest of the year. And remember, this same basic process works for almost any fruit. So this is a fantastic way to preserve almost any abundance of fruit. Just be sure to check with tested recipes for processing times. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.